So good evening and welcome everyone. So this is our discussion about the Brazilian elections. I will in a moment pass the word to Claudia. Claudia, as sitting on that opposite end of the table, as some of you may know, is a former journalist. She was a correspondent for O Estado de São Paulo here in DC. Prior to that, she was the China correspondent, also for Estado de São Paulo, and I currently have the pleasure of having her in one of my classes. So without further ado, let me just pass the word to her so that we can get this started. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Well, I'm sure we're going to have a very exciting discussion about the most polarized Brazilian election in recent memory. And I'd like to use an anecdote to show to you how controversial Jair Bolsonaro, our new president, is. During the campaign, Marine Le Pen distanced herself from Bolsonaro and said he was too extremist to be considered a far-right candidate. So, Bolsonaro is a nostalgic of the military dictatorship. He praises torture. He says a good criminal is a dead criminal. And he makes disparaging comments about women, gays, blacks, and indigenous people. And he, in spite of the fact that he is in the House for 27 years and has 3 sons that are professional politicians, he managed to run as an anti-establishment candidate. 1 week before the election, he declared that his opposition should be jailed or leave the country. After his victory, he moderated his speech, his rhetoric, and said he would respect the Constitution, democracy, and liberty. He's a former armed captain, and generals will have a very important role in his administration. Bolsonaro won with 58 million votes, compared to 47 million votes that were given to his adversary, Fernando Haddad from PT. But we have 11 million blank votes, which in Brazil, since vote is mandatory, is a way to protest against both candidates. And it means that we have exactly the same amount of votes for Bolsonaro and votes against Bolsonaro. So he will inherit a very divided country, a very polarized country, with a lot of problems. We are in a very difficult economic situation, with a crisis in the public finances, anemic growth, and high unemployment. To understand what happened and what lies ahead, we have a terrific panel of experts that know Brazil very well. To my left is Clifford Young, who is an adjunct lecturer at SAI's Latin America Studies Program and president of Ipsos Public Affairs in the US. He also leads Ipsos Global Election and Political Polling Risk Practice. Considered an expert in polling in emerging markets, Clifford lived for 10 years in Brazil, working as a director of Ipsos there. To his left is Matthew Taylor, is associate professor at the American University School of International Service, where his teachings focus on state capacity, corruption, and Latin America political economy. He has lived and worked extensively in Brazil, most recently from 2006 to 2011 as a member of the faculty at the University of São Paulo. Then we have Professor Peter. We have Peter Hagen, who is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. From 1993 to 2010, he served as president of the organization. Hagen writes and speaks widely on hemispheric issues and has testified more than a dozen times before the US Congress. He worked for the Ford Foundation in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Then we have Professor Riordan Roe, Director and Professor Emeritus of the Latin America Studies Program at SAIS. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former national president of the Latin America Studies Association. His most recent book from 2016 is Brazil, What Everyone Needs to Know. And finally, we have Monica De Boule. She holds the Riordan Roe Chair in Latin American Studies at SAIS, and is the director of the Latin America Studies Program in Emerging Markets Specialization. She's a prolific commentator on Brazilian issues and has columns in two of the main Brazilian newspapers, O Estado de São Paulo and O Globo. And let me say the rules of the game. Each one we will speak for 5 minutes, and Monica delegated me the task to control the 5 minutes. After that, I will raise some questions, and then we will open for questions from the audience. Please.
So I'm going to begin, and I have 5
Yes.
minutes, right? So I'll set the stage very quickly. My name's Cliff Young. I'm a professional pollster. I'm a lecturer here as well at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I work for Ipsos. Ipsos is the 3rd largest market research and polling firm in the world. We have offices in 90 countries, and obviously we've been doing work in Brazil for a very, very long time. I've done 6 presidential elections in Brazil. This is my 6th. And I do agree with, I do agree, and I think I'll agree with the panelists, this was the most differentiated, difficult, polarized, fractured of all of them. And what I want to do very quickly is set the stage, the contextual stage for Brazil. And then I want to put Brazil very quickly in global perspective, because what we're seeing in Brazil, we're seeing everywhere in the world. It might take on different flavors and manifest itself differently, but the populist underlying sort of tendencies are expressing themselves in Western Europe, all over Latin America, and indeed here in the United States as well. So very quickly, what was this election about? That's always the first question I always ask. Going into an electoral cycle, what is this about? What are the voter demands? What do they want? What does public opinion want? They didn't want your bread and butter things. They weren't so interested in jobs or healthcare or security. These things were important, and they always had been important over at least the last 4 electoral cycles, presidential cycles. They weren't interested in that. They were lower priority demands. They were principally concerned with corruption. They were concerned after Mensalão, that is a vote-buying scandal in the mid-2000s, the mid-2000s, and then obviously Lava Jato, the car wash scandal. They were concerned about a political class that was not delivering on their primary demands. This is very important because corruption had heretofore, up to that point, up to this point, had never been a key driver, a key issue in Brazil. It had been a secondary or tertiary issue. It became the issue of the day. The backdrop to that was a deep-seated feeling of discontent with the system, belief that the system is broken. We're talking 80% plus of the population believing that, whether they were on the right or the left. A widespread belief, once again, supermajority belief, that politicians, traditional politicians, parties and politicians don't care about people like them, and that, once again, supermajority belief and demands that they needed a strong leader to take the system back, take the country back from the rich and the powerful. And so when you ranked order at the beginning of the electoral cycle, those key demands, they weren't those bread and butter issues, as I was saying. They were corruption in first place and having a strong leader to take back the country. And this differentiated whom? It was Bolsonaro, right? Early in the year, we had Barbosa as well. He was a former Supreme Court justice. He was very well positioned, actually. Indeed, in my class this last semester, the spring semester, we picked him to win it, but then he dropped out. But Bolsonaro, he would have won it. He might have been the president if he had stayed in, but he decided to drop out. But Bolsonaro was the only candidate of a field of 6, 7 legitimate candidates, another maybe 15 or so if you add in all the small ones. He was the only candidate in the entire field that met these specific demands. Indeed, over the course of the entire election, both first and second round, he had a 25-point lead on corruption and being a strong leader vis-a-vis the next in place, and that was the PT candidate Haddad. Okay, so that's the first point. He was the candidate that met those demands. It's important to note on the side about the PT, we expected there to be a PT Bolsonaro second round as well. Why? Because PT is the only party that has any sort of identification in Brazil, somewhere between 20 and 25. So you've got this baked-in base that in a multi-party, multi-candidate first round, where the vote is pulverized, where it's fractured, you get enough votes to get to the second round. So that's the first point. First point is Bolsonaro met the demands. He was the one that was most convergent. And in this scenario of a broken system, and this is what we're seeing globally, in this scenario, in this environment of a broken system, actually, there are points to be gained from authenticity, even if you're truculent. So think Trump being truculent. Think Bolsonaro being truculent. These sorts of attributes in normal scenarios, normal situations, do not have a premium. They had a premium in this electoral cycle. And the last point I want to make, just a kind of a general contextual point, is that yes, we're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing this across the Western world. And there are two basic vectors. The one vector is the system is broken, the society is in decline, the established is not delivering on our basic demands. The point being here is they take on different flavors. And so in Brazil, because of the sort of candidates that were there, because of the history, we had Bolsonaro, a right-leaning or a far-right candidate. In Mexico, actually López Obrador fit that same profile that though he is on the left. Anti-corruption was the key, and indeed across Latin America, anti-corruption has taken over in most countries, and most of the large countries, the other key issues being economy and jobs and security. The last point I want to make is we're seeing the same sort of thing in the United States and Europe. Widespread belief, supermajority belief that the system is broken. There's a demand for populist-like figures that are willing to break the rule to try to take the country back. Does that sound familiar here? Take the country back, right? The difference between Latin America, more specifically Brazil, and the rest of the Western world, that is Europe, continental Europe on the one hand, the United States on the other, is that you have strong nativist drivers, strong anti-immigration drivers. So the key issue in a place like the United States or in continental Europe, or even Brexit if you throw it in there, was some form of anti-immigration and nativist sentiment that drove the outcome at the polls. But once again, in Latin America, more specifically in Brazil, it was the demand for a strong leader and one that would take the country back from the corrupt and powerful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Matthew.
Well, we're sitting in the order, we're sitting because I drew the law and order straw. So I follow, I think, fairly closely from what Cliff, where Cliff took us. And so, as Cliff was saying, Bolsonaro was very much elected as the law and order candidate. And during his campaign, he didn't make many concrete proposals in this regard, but he made explicit his view that there was a close link between crime and corruption in Brazil. What I'd like to talk about right now is the possibility that this emphasis on law and order, on crime and corruption, can have the potential for bad outcomes. Because I think that Bolsonaro will be under enormous pressure to meet some of his campaign promises. And I think that his rhetoric sort of naturally falls into this area. It's sort of where he naturally goes. It's his area of expertise. So let me begin with crime. As many of you know, Brazil has one of the most violent societies in the hemisphere and the highest absolute homicide rate. And the tragedy, I think, for Brazil right now is having elected a president who's a law and order president, the president in Brazil doesn't actually have many law and order tools. And so most police, for example, are state police. The 27 states have both a military police and a civil police. The military police, despite the name, are not military. They can become subordinate to the military in times of crisis, but really the military police are simply police out on the streets. And the civil police are more investigative kind of detectives. Most state police are rivals. They see each other as rivals, and so there's been a lack of coordination between the civil and the military police. And in the current scenario of fiscal tightening in Brazil, or fiscal disaster, if we want to go there, and I know Monica will go there, the states are in a really perilous situation fiscally and will have an enormous difficulty doing anything to increase policing, the numbers of police or salaries or whatever the case may be. So where does that leave Bolsonaro? Well, Bolsonaro, I think, has possibly three responses on the security front. In terms of the most muscular responses that he could undertake, one possibility is that he could use the federal police. And Brazil has a federal police force similar to the FBI. But this is difficult for a number of reasons, not least of which is that this may be unconstitutional because the federal police has a fairly limited role, especially at the state level. The federal police, furthermore, are quite overstretched. The last time I looked, I think there were 18,000 members of the federal police. They're engaged in border control, they're engaged in anti-money laundering, they're supporting Lava Jato. They do border, those of you who go into Brazil, you sometimes run into the federal police. This is not a force that has a lot of spare capacity. The second muscular response that he might be able to engage in is constitutional intervention. And as some of you know, Temer did this in Rio de Janeiro. This was a face-saving technique for Temer because he couldn't get any constitutional amendments through. And under Article 60 of the Brazilian Constitution, if there is an intervention, a federal intervention in the states, you cannot even begin to work and deliberate on constitutional amendments. So this was face-saving for Temer, who was not able to get anything through Congress, or very little through Congress. But given the ample legislative agenda that we'll be talking about in a moment that Bolsonaro would like to pass, it's going to be very difficult for him to use this policy alternative. So where do I think he'll turn? The second possibility is that he'll look for legislative change. And he has talked about loosening gun laws, reducing the age of criminal responsibility, and raising penalties across the board. There's sort of a logistical problem here, which is he's going to have an enormous legislative agenda. So where in the ranking will this fall? I think it will fall fairly high. But that being said, as policy solutions, these are not perhaps the best potential way of solving the security issue. And the primary reason for that is that most of those changes in legislation will lead to prison sentences, higher prison sentences, and therefore contribute to prison overcrowding. If you've been following organized crime in Brazil, you may know that the PCC and the Comando Vermelho are two of the largest gangs in Brazil, the two most important, and the PCC certainly has derived much of its strength from its control of prison gangs. So if you increase the number of people in prison, you increase the leverage of the primary criminal organization in Brazil. The last thing that he can do on crime, I think, is to increase the rhetoric about the use of deadly force, and I think he's already doing this. This has potentially very dangerous consequences, not least because there were 5,000 people killed in Brazil by police in 2017, out of a total of 59,000 homicides, for 8.5% of homicides committed by police. So I'm not sure, that rhetoric is leading in a very positive place. On corruption, just very briefly, because I'm running out of time, I think the most important thing to say here is that Bolsonaro has fed expectations that are unrealistic. One of the places where I saw this most clearly was actually plugged for Ipsos here. They did a poll that showed that I think around 70% of Brazilians thought that the biggest problem in the pension system was corruption. Sorry, that's not the source of all of the problems. And I think that corruption and fighting corruption is a good thing, but it's not how you're going to solve the fiscal problem.
Do I pay you now or later?
Later,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
Under the table. So the second thing I would say about this is, he has talked about empowering people like Judge Sergio Moro, perhaps appointing Moro to the Supreme Court. Those of you who follow Brazil know that Moro was the presiding judge on much of Lava Jato. Lava Jato is still very much the exception that proves the rule that there is impunity, widespread impunity for corruption in Brazil. And so Moro is perhaps an interesting person to emulate, but he on his own can't do much. The only concrete measure that Bolsonaro has put forward on the corruption front is a promise that he would like to see the 10 measures against corruption, which were proposed via public initiative 3 years ago, passed into law, even though these have been continuously contested and essentially watered down by Congress. The last thing here, and I'll just stop here and we can come back to it in Q&A, is simply that Moro has said the other way he's going to fight corruption is by getting rid of toma lá, da cá politics, the horse trading of the legislative process. This is in a Congress in which the mean party, the average party, holds 3.5% of the seats. You can't get rid of toma lá, da cá. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Monica. Thank you, Claudia. Let me say that I'm supposed to provide the optimistic scenario.
It only goes downhill from here.
I want to talk about Bolsonaro too, and you know, he's referred to very frequently as the tropical Trump, and there's predictions that there's going to be a new era in U.S.-Brazil relations, because they both sort of have similar views of the world. But I really don't want to talk about how they're similar. What I want to talk about is how they're different. And there are really three differences that I really want to point to. The most important is really not a difference between the two gentlemen, but rather it's a difference in the tasks, the challenges, the problems, the crises they face, or they faced when they entered government. When Trump took office, the U.S. was a more or less stable, orderly, and relatively healthy nation. Certainly more so than Brazil is today. Sure, the U.S. has many deep problems, but the economy had been growing steadily for 8 years. You had, while Brazil is really still struggling to emerge from the deepest recession it's had in perhaps a century. But I'm going to let Monica talk about the economy. But clearly, there was a big gap between economic performance in Brazil and how the economy was performing in the U.S. Similarly, we know that many Americans were angry, frustrated, even disgusted with their institutions. We have enough polling data on that. But Brazilians appear to hold their institutions in virtual contempt. And I won't try to explain that, but just give you one datum. When Barack Obama left office, he had public approval of 53% of the U.S. population. The current president and his immediate predecessor are going to leave office with less than 10% approval rating. That and the reflection of the concern about institutions is reflected in those numbers. The fact that almost everybody objected to Dilma Rousseff, and then the person who took her place, her vice president at the time, took the country in a different direction or tried, also is down around 5% in approval polls. It shows something about views about how the government performs. And it's pretty easy to go on. I mean, you started going on about violent crime, corruption. You can talk about dismal public services as well. And the U.S. faces many of these problems. We read about it every day. But the fact is that the U.S. is just in much better. The U.S. is not in a crisis situation. And the fact is that Brazil, in many respects, is that, and Bolsonaro has to deal with that. And in one way to put this is Brazil's problems are real and deep. They are not the symbolic problems that I believe that Trump took and made into his own, like huge migrations, illegal migration was a major one. unemployment and trade were major problems. These turned out to be symbols of something else. In Brazil, the problems are real and present and very, very deep. And indeed, Trump now claims that most of these problems have been solved. So in 2 years, if Trump can do that, that would be pretty good. But I think that he faces a far more difficult. There are two other differences. Trump really did, I know I'm going to get booed at this, but did come to office with some real accomplishments. I mean, he did make quite a fortune. Let's not discuss how he made it or whether he paid taxes on it, but he made a fortune that most people would envy. And he also was the star of one of the most watched television programs over a 5 or 6 year period. That's a major accomplishment. I'd like to be a star of a TV show for that long. And, you know, he actually out-debated, out-campaigned 16 of the most powerful Republicans in the United States, senators, governors, corporate executives, surgeons. Bolsonaro, 27 years in Parliament, has almost no memorable achievements to his credit. It's hard. The one thing he did was to win the nomination and the election of president, which is something. But remember, he didn't debate or campaign even. He was wounded, stabbed in a knife attack, and really did not participate in the campaign. This was all created, these images of him, in many respects. The third difference is that Trump came to office. And I hope there's not anybody that's going to be unhappy with this, but really with the Republican Party in his back pocket. There's no question that he had the support of the Republican Party from the day he took office, and he continues to manage it. And I won't go into detail of how he does it or what but he started off from a very powerful position with control of both houses of Congress, and certainly Bolsonaro will have the second largest party in the Brazilian Congress. Reardon will tell us about that.
Maybe.
But he represents only 10% of Congress, that party. It's an inexperienced party. Yes, he has a number of natural allies that are signing on in part because he made it. Oh, okay, 1 minute left. But anyway, he certainly does not have the kind of strong underpinnings, force, that, that Trump brought to the White House. In short, Bolsonaro faces far more difficult problems, challenges. He comes to office without the credentials or achievements of even a Trump, and he doesn't have any assured alignment, coalition of political support behind him. Bolsonaro has an immense task. He really has to repair a badly broken Brazil. Trump had a reasonably well-functioning U.S. to welcome his presidency. The biggest danger to Brazil, in my view, is not that Bolsonaro imposes or his extremist views, his very right-wing conservative agenda, but rather the biggest danger is that he can't deal with the real crises of the economy and corruption and all. And that you are going to see that it's not what Bolsonaro is going to do. It's what he probably can't get done that's going to undermine Brazil. That's the optimistic view.
Thank you, Peter, for that defense of Donald Trump. As a New Yorker who lives in a Trump building bought many years before we thought that Donald would become the monster that he has become, I don't want to contradict you, but there are different opinions about Donald Trump. As a New Yorker, we have very different views of Donald Trump and his fortune. To be a construction person in New York City, and Donald is not from New York City, he's from Queens, as Jared Kushner is from New Jersey. These are very different people, very strange people, who make their money in very weird ways. And we shan't go into that because we might be indicted. But what is important, and my 5 minutes will go quickly, is that Brazil is still a constitutional democracy as of today. It means, of course, that there is a Congress that has been democratically elected. The Congress has certain prerogatives and powers, and that will be one of the great challenges. And it is a tremendous challenge. The lower house in January in Brasilia will have 30 political parties. 30. The Senate will have 21 political parties. Of the 32 senators who are running for re-election, only 8 survived. The lower house only had 53% of the deputies to win re-election, the lowest rate since 1985. The right wing, Mr. Bolsonaro and his allies, have about 106 deputies. You need 308 to get anything done in the Brazilian Congress. And one needs to deal with the independents and the centrist political parties, which have no ideology and no particular platform or program. You're dealing with a multi-party presidential system. Now, we all remember why Lula's first term was so successful, right? They bought votes. The mensalão meant the big monthly payoff, and he passed legislation. And we all sat here saying, well, isn't this man really quite splendid, Mr. Lula? He actually knows how to make the Brazilian Congress work. Well, if you have hundreds of millions of dollars to pass out to people who wound up in jail, you can make things work. Does Mr. Bolsonaro understand a multi-party presidential system? Is he going to be able to do the negotiations that Lula was successful in doing during his first term, which first Dilma didn't understand Congress, didn't understand much about Brasilia. Temer, who threw her out and succeeded her, didn't understand how to work Congress, even though he was a member of Congress. And we now have the real challenge of a multi-party presidential system where somebody in the Planalto, the presidential palace, has got to sit down with Bolsonaro, even though he spent many years in Brasilia. He didn't do very much when he was in Brasilia. Explain to him how Brasilia really works. And it really works by buying votes, putting together coalitions that change almost every day because people walk in and out of political parties. You may join a political party to be elected, doesn't mean you're going to be in that party 6 months later. If you get a better deal across the aisle, you're going to move. And they do all the time. It's a great slot machine. And that is exactly what Bolsonaro is going to come up against when he reaches the Planalto on January 1st. Terrible date to have an inauguration in Brazil. And the real issue that Congress will face is not so much dealing with Bolsonaro, but really dealing with a much broader question I want to spend the last few minutes on, that Brazil is neither competitive nor productive. It is a somewhat bankrupt society in terms of the things it needs to do to be grandeza. Brazil has always dreamed of being a great country. The grandeza goes back a century and a half. It's not going to happen because grandeza really means that you're competitive and that you're productive. If you look at the OECD scores, the PISA scores on science, math, and reading, the top scorers are the Asian countries, along with Finland, Estonia, Canada. Brazil, out of 72 countries, ranked in the last PISA rating 63 in terms of math and science, between Indonesia and Peru. In terms of math, it stood between Jordan and the Republic of Macedonia, ranked 65. Reading between Albania and Jordan. Albania and Jordan, where Brazil sits in the PISA scores for reading. You can't be a competitive and productive economy if your people can't read. And that is a major challenge for Bolsonaro and for the new Congress. They can say whatever they want about reform and other areas, unless they deal with issues that have been overlooked for decades, if not centuries. Brazil will remain exactly where it is, number out of 72 in the 60s. And if you look at the global index on competitiveness put up by the World Economic Forum, they rank 137 economies in the last rating. Brazil ranks number 80. Guess where it sits between Tajikistan and the Ukraine? Tajikistan? Albania? This is Brazil, right? Nosso Brazil. It's behind Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay. And they have 12 pillars by which they rank the countries of the 137 economies. Infrastructure is 109. Anyone ever try to drive on the roads in Brazil? Ever try to drive a lorry to the ports in Santos? Don't bother. Take a long time to get there. The macroeconomic environment, as Monica will discuss, they rank 124. Primary education, it ranks 125 out of 137. 125 out of 137. Students aren't learning anything, which is a relatively big challenge if you want to be productive and competitive in the world economy at the present time. Innovation, they rank 85. How do you compete against China or against any of the other industrial countries in terms of innovation? You don't have people innovating, which means if you can't read and write, you have to innovate. And finally, on institutions, one of the other issues which I think drives us really at this table, in terms of public trust in politicians, where do you think Brazil ranks out of 137 countries? Public trust in politicians. 137. I rest my case.
It only gets worse from here. So let me just say one word about all of the indicators on education that Professor Rouet has just cited. One of the key proposals, if we can call it that, of the Bolsonaro platform is to institute distance learning, not for university-level students, but for all students. So imagine how that would work in a country with the numbers that Professor Rouet has just cited. And this is a serious proposal that's being considered by some of the people who are working for him. So that being said, let me go into the macroeconomy where the story really is very, very bad. Brazil is coming out of a recession, as probably all of you know. We did have an extremely bad recession in 2015 and 2016. We had a drop in per capita GDP of over 10% in those 2 years. 2017 saw very modest growth of about 1%, and this year is not likely to be much different from 2017. So possibly we might get somewhere close to 1.5%, but this is not nearly enough growth to deal with the more than 13 million unemployed people who are currently, as I said, unemployed. So with this, putting this together with a context where there's very low productivity and very low, the prospects for actually growing the economy are grim, to say the least, it is very unlikely that we will see a huge burst in growth that's going to accommodate the millions and millions of unemployed people in the country. So that's one side of the macroeconomic story. The other side of the macroeconomic story is the fiscal crisis that Brazil is facing. And many may not want to call it a crisis just yet, simply because, you know, markets are currently very euphoric about the Bolsonaro presidency, but nonetheless, there is a crisis. This is a country that has a deficit of 7.5% of GDP and possibly rising if no fiscal adjustments are done. And by the way, Mr. Bolsonaro has not proposed any fiscal adjustment to the economy. This is also an economy where debt to GDP is rising in the very short term. It currently stands at about 83 to 84% of GDP. Using the IMF's data, I don't use Brazilian data to look at Brazilian debt because the central bank takes a lot of stuff out. So we use IMF because that's comparable across the board. And if we simply look at, you know, the basic trajectory of the deficit and the debt without much growth over the next 3 years, Brazil will soon reach 100% of GDP debt, which is pretty massive. The good side of this is that, by and large, the maturity of the debt is still, on average, not too short. But it is getting shorter because obviously what happens in situations like this is that for investors to want to refinance Brazil or to keep on financing Brazil, they will ask for shorter maturities and they will ask for greater premia. So the prospects going forward without reform are not promising at all. So it is my read that the country is already facing a fiscal crisis. Now, what has Mr. Bolsonaro proposed to do about this? Absolutely nothing, because what he presented, the government platform or the party manifesto, as it were, that he presented, was an 81-page PowerPoint presentation. I have been looking at party platforms for the G20 countries as part of another research project that I'm involved in, and quite frankly, this is the thinnest program I have ever come across, and quite frankly, again, one of my two kids would have done a much better job at putting together a PowerPoint presentation of the sort. On the economy, what we have are, out of the 81 pages, something like 12 on issues such as Social Security reform or pension reform. There's one page for that, one page for pension reform with 2 paragraphs on it that say absolutely nothing. There is one page on tax reform, a very important issue in Brazil, which is never going to get done, but nonetheless, one page on tax reform, and that one page says nothing. There's one page on restoring growth, and you read it and you come out with nothing. There's one page on restoring productivity, you read it and you come out with nothing. So basically, here's someone who has just run for president without an economic program in a country that's facing a fiscal crisis and has a very bad economy at that. So that's where we are. Now, his campaign was not about the economic agenda, as Cliff was saying earlier. His campaign was actually about law and order, violence and crime, corruption. So he didn't go to any debates, by the way, in part because of the very tragic stabbing incident, but in part also because he refused to go to any debates. So we don't really know what he stands for in terms of his economic program. His electorate, and this is very important, his electorate did not elect him to do any economic reform. And in fact, when you look at his electorate, there are people who are pro-pension reform, which is an urgent issue that Brazil needs to address, and people who are anti-pension reform. There are people who are pro-privatization and people who are anti-privatization. There are people who are pro-fiscal adjustment and people who are anti-fiscal adjustment. So with an electorate like that, it's very hard to see how reforms actually get done. And this is without even mentioning the very basic issue of how you build a coalition in Congress, as Professor Rouet was saying, to pass reforms which are going to be hugely unpopular. Pension reform is always unpopular, especially in a context where the economy is not doing well, which is Brazil's case right now.
1 minute.
Related to that, and I will end, related to that, we have now a transition. And the transition is 48 hours old. And in this transition, we have already seen in Mr. Bolsonaro's inner circle a lot of problems and a lot of headbutting amongst people who are trying to grab power. So we have seen in that context headbutting between his chief economic advisor and his incoming chief of staff on pension reform. His chief economic advisor has said one thing, his incoming chief of staff has said another. They both disagreed publicly, and it's all over the press. The second thing that we have seen is today, his chief economic advisor, Mr. Paulo Guedes, the one that markets thought would be the savior to Brazil's economy, saying things like he would use the country's international reserves to pay down debt. You don't do that when you have a fiscal crisis brewing. You just don't. He has also mentioned that he would sell reserves in the amount of $100 billion if the exchange rate, the real to the dollar exchange rate exceeded 5. If you say something like that, you're signaling to markets that you expect a crisis. You don't do something like that either. So we have seen in the past 48 hours an extremely messy transition, not surprisingly, because we've had a campaign without a proper government platform, without a proper economic plan, and now we are very much in the dark as to what's going to actually come out of this mess and out of this government. I'll end, I promise, very, very soon, but just by saying this. In 2016, when Rousseff was impeached, in part, and I won't make any judgment values about her impeachment, but I'll just say this. She was partly impeached to prevent or to interrupt a fiscal crisis that was about to happen. I fear strongly that we have just elected that fiscal crisis on Sunday. Thank you.
Well, I know Clifford has a little bit of a more optimistic view, and I hope he speaks about that. And I also would like to talk on the issue of Brazil in this broad context of this right-wing wave. Yesterday, the Folha de São Paulo published a very interesting interview with Steve Bannon. And he said that Bolsonaro is a representative of this right wing to which Trump, Orban, and Salvini in Italy all belong, and that he intends to go frequently to Brazil after Bolsonaro inauguration. One thing that intrigues me in this narrative is the fact, you said that Bolsonaro voters want to take back the country from rich and powerful people. But his most strongest support was exactly among the most educated and the people with the higher income. How we square that with this populist narrative?
Okay, so to the specific question, then maybe the general one, right? It's symbolic. Taking the country back from the rich, powerful, and the corrupt is a symbolic. It's symbolism. It's not. We're not talking concretely. And it's part of a syndrome we call, at Ipsos, I call the Caudillo syndrome or the strongman syndrome, which is this system is broken, we're a rich, powerful country, why am I not rich and powerful, why don't I have those privileges? Oh, because the system's rigged against someone like me, I need a strong leader to take the country back from the rich, the powerful, and the corrupt. So it's symbolic. Mm-hmm. So first, and he was hovering on the symbolic level for the most part, and his truculent nature just kind of reinforces credibility. I do have a more optimistic view, and for the long term for Brazil, and a pessimistic one for the short term for slightly different reasons. Let me just go sort of the optimistic long term. It's the fourth largest democracy in the world. 210 million people went to the polls on Sunday, and they expressed their will. And what they expressed their will in an open and free election, and what were they saying? Bolsonaro is a symptom. He's not a cause of the scenario. They're saying to the elite, to the powerful, to politicians, you are not delivering for me. And indeed, if you look at the data over time, over the last 15 years, since 2000, what did we see in Brazil? Massive expansion of the middle class, Brazilian middle class, I call it the middling class, not quite American middle class levels, millions, tens of millions of people entering into it. And what we saw over that period of time was where that voter demands, public opinion demands were changing. It went from bread and butter, meat and potato or rice and bean issues that I need a job to provide food to my family, those basic needs. And the demand shifted to services. I need better health care for me and my family. I need better education for my children. I need to be safe on the street when I'm walking. If I live in a big city, I need to be able to get to work in less than an hour and not be stuck in traffic, taking 3 buses, and it takes me 3 hours. And that rise of what I call the quality of life agenda really what was stark leading up to 2015. Indeed, you can understand the protests in 2013, I think I have the dates right, 2013, as this new emerging middle class was demanding better services. And what do you have? You have an economic crisis all tangled up in the chaos of Lava Jato. And when you talk to people in focus groups, what they say is the following: I don't have better health care. I don't feel safe on the street. I can't get to work. It takes me 3 hours, 4 hours of my day. My kids don't have a good education because of the corrupt and the powerful. And so let me think about this strategically long term. Is this not a corrective reaction to society, to a system that's actually broken? I think we have to ask ourselves that question. Now, whether Bolsonaro can do anything about it or not, whether he just rode on the wave of this anti-corruption, anti-system, anti-establishment tsunami in some cases, that's another question. But those are real demands. Corruption's a real bottleneck in Brazil. I lived there for 10 years, worked and ran a business. It is chaos. It's chaos to run a business in a place like Brazil because of all these sort of issues that were mentioned. The last point, so I'm optimistic long term because I think public opinion has it right. The short term, short term, I'm very, very worried because in this age of uncertainty, in this age of a broken system, both in Brazil and globally, the half-life of a government's approval rating is seriously cut. Approval ratings are basically the currency for governments to push agendas, and independent of whether he has a good proposal or not a good proposal, let's set that aside, and I'm not an expert on that, I have no idea. But what I can say, what worries me, is that his approval ratings are in the gutter in 6 months, because that's the trend we're seeing across the world, that the half-life of new governments, their approval ratings is very, very short, maybe not longer than 6 months. If he's in the 40s or the 30s on a binary scale, independent of the problems with Congress, he won't be able to get anything done. So long-term optimistic, short-term pessimistic. I think his half-life is very short.
Cliff, the people you talked about voted for Haddad and the PT, for God's sake.
Yes.
The people who voted for Bolsonaro don't go to public schools. They go to private schools.
Yes.
They don't really care that Brazil ranks between Tajikistan and God knows who in terms of the rankings of the Global Report on Competitiveness. They're all going to private schools. They have helicopters to go to work. They have large walls around their condos. They have guards and dogs. And they voted for Bolsonaro not to change the system, but to preserve their system. They don't give a damn about the PT workers. Quite frankly, let's be very blunt about this. And they can go on complaining about, PT people go on moaning and complaining. They have lousy public schools, and they have lousy hospitals, and they have lousy this. It's not going to change under Bolsonaro. That wasn't his platform.
No.
The financial markets are Bolsonaro's backbone. You don't think they go to public schools? No. Do you think they worry about their pensions? No. Do they worry about their children's future? No, because they'll come here to SICE and go to school. And that is the difference in this election. Bolsonaro did not run to solve Brazil's basic problems in terms of competitiveness and productivity. He ran to, Cliff is right, he ran because of security, insecurity, and corruption. But do you think one man, Bolsonaro, is going to root out corruption? Let's wait for his mensalão. When he finds he can't pass anything in Congress, what will he do? Like they all do, they will turn to the mensalão. I will take a large bet on that, at least $1.
One thing that was raised in the campaign many times was the risk of Bolsonaro taking the path of illiberal democracies that transforming Brazil, like being elected and once in power, undermine Brazil institutions and be an authoritarian leader. Peter, you talked about the fragility of Brazilian institutions. Do you see a risk to Brazilian democracy with Bolsonaro?
Sure, but I see a problem with democracy before Bolsonaro became president. In other words, what's really remarkable is, you know, back in 2011, when Lula was just leaving, everyone was saying he was a magician. He was getting 88% approval rating. This includes the rich, the poor, the middle class. We're all so enthusiastic. And
not the rich.
let me tell you, I think you realize the traffic wasn't any better back 10 years ago. Neither were the ports, neither were the lorries getting there on time. In other words, but the leadership got 88%. Geraldo Ackman, who got, what, about 7% of the vote, or maybe 9?
No, he got less than 5.
He got less than 5. He won the governorship of Sao Paulo by a landslide twice. Just 4 years ago, he won with close to 60% of the vote. Things didn't change in that period so dramatically that all of a sudden you'd have this kind of inversion, particularly the things that you were talking about, Cliff. The traffic, the schools, the hospitals, they were there, they were performing exactly. So, in other words, there has to be something more here. And I think that probably, and I think I've said this a lot about Trump, that no one should underestimate Trump. That he has shown over time that he's not restricted to 15% of the vote or 20% or 40%, that there was not going to be pushback from the Republicans, that wouldn't be stopped. And maybe we should be saying that a little bit about Bolsonaro, that maybe we shouldn't underestimate his talents, and that he will sort of move ahead with a system that's much less restrictive than the U.S. system, with much fewer sort of norms and guidelines. You yourself say corruption was not a problem for the system, but it was the system in Brazil.
No, I said exactly that. Corruption. What does the Mensalão, for God's sake, was corruption.
Right.
Yeah. Can I just...
So, but my point is very, very basic. Are we underestimating Bolsonaro?
Well, I think he was the right person, right man at the right time. I'll just disagree a bit, Peter, just a tad, is there were massive changes in voter demands over a decade and a half. We went from a regime where the Brazilian population, the number one issue was basically the economy and jobs. And over the course of this time, other sorts of issues, the kind of trappings of a middle-class lifestyle, all the services that I had mentioned became, if you take them as a cluster, became increasingly more important. It's very clear in the data that you had this shift in the demand profiles. Corruption still wasn't important. They were basic services, like the ones I listed: transportation, crime, healthcare, and education as a cluster increased over this 15 years and outstripped jobs in the economy, which was the key issue from '89 until about the mid-2000s. What happened with the economic downturn in Lava Jato is corruption got imprinted on this emerging middle-class mind, and their expression and their frustration of not having good services in their heads was linked to the issue of corruption. Now, I'm not making any valid judgment whether it's right or wrong, but there was this massive demand shift with public opinion, and in 15, 16, 17, corruption was a manifestation or the explanation as to why these basic services were not being delivered in an effective way. Sorry.
Yeah, let's go to the audience.
I'm sorry, by the way.
And please raise your questions, identify yourself, and say to which panelist you are addressing your question. Let's start here. There is a microphone. A little bit, yes. No.
Does it work?
Yes.
I have a question about environmental issues. Brazil faced worse deforestation rates and environmental crisis in probably 2005 under Lula. And then after smart steps, Brazil actually turned that down, or turned it around in a big way and actually recovered very much. One of the characteristics of Bolsonaro has been a number of threats regarding environmental issues, for example, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, closing or merging the Ministry of Environment with Agriculture, no areas.
Can you make your question very briefly, please?
How powerful is Bolsonaro to turn this around and open, I guess, the scenario for environmental degradation, or go back to what it was 2005, 2006?
Okay.
Well, let me address that. The signal that he's given today, again, because he's flip-flopped on this quite a bit, But the signal today about merging the agriculture ministry with the environmental industry is a very strong indication that he cares nothing about environmental issues. And in fact, he seems to be very much towing the line. In a lot of things, he seems to be towing the Trumpian line in sort of saying these are regulations that hamper business, and therefore we need to remove them because they hamper especially agribusiness, which in the context of a country that has very low productivity and competitiveness, this is the one sector that is broadly productive and competitive, but that's not to say that you can just trample on environmental laws and do whatever you want. The other thing that I'd say to that question is that of the support or of the people who have said that they will support him, and here's the thing about the way that the system works in Brazil. People who express support for a president during the transition will not necessarily hold that support after the president is in power. So there's a timing consistency problem here as far as support goes. But at the moment, these big agribusiness groups, the so-called Bancada Ruralista in Congress, has been supportive of Bolsonaro's candidacy. And in many ways, and just to bring the point back to something that Professor Rouet was saying, when I think of Bolsonaro, when I think of the changes that have happened in Brazil, despite the fact of the things that Cliff has said about the changes in sentiment within Brazilian society, what's happened in Brazil is exactly what Giuseppe di Lampedusa wrote in his Il Gatto Pardo. Everything changed so that everything could remain the same. This is what we're seeing, and this is what we're likely to see.
Yeah, here.
Hi, I'm Bruce Segaris, an attorney here in Washington. So one thing that you haven't discussed, of course, is foreign policy, and especially U.S.-Brazil relations. And since there have been some discussion of similarities between the two presidents, so one thing we can see is whether there will be any improvements between the U.S. and Brazil. I mean, there are some trade problems now, but there could be, for instance, bilateral investment treaty, a double tax treaty, which they've tried for many years but haven't been able to do it. The U.S. can assist Brazil in education. There have been some innovation attempts lately between the two countries. So I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about Brazilian foreign policy and specifically U.S.-Brazil relations.
And just to complement the question, it's interesting to note that the first trip that Bolsonaro will make abroad will be to Chile, US, and Israel, which is a big departure of traditional alliance or expressions of interest that Brazilian presidents usually have. Matthew, can you take that?
Just a plug for the last question, that anybody who's interested in environmental issues, you may wish to read Kathy Hostetler's piece in Foreign Policy, where she does a good job of bringing some nuance to that question, and particularly pointing to the fact that Bolsonaro is not great on the environment, but he has expressed support for renewables, which I think, take what you can get. On foreign policy, Claudia said it well. I think his first visits say a lot about what the priorities will be. But going to Chile suggests, as Guedes said very clearly today, Mercosur is not a priority. In the grand scheme of things, that's not a bad thing for a country that desperately needs to open to the world economy. Whether the Chilean route is the correct route for the Brazilian economy is questionable, though, right? So that's one issue. On U.S.-Brazilian relations, here I think that there's going to be a lot of symbolism. We don't yet know who the foreign minister will be. Until we know that, it's hard to know exactly what we should expect to see. But I would be hesitant to say that U.S.-Brazilian relations are going to take a quantum leap forward, partly because Bolsonaro, remember, comes out of the military tradition in Brazil. The military tradition has a very strong commitment to national sovereignty, a very strong suspicion of the United States. And so this is a problem. perhaps one place where they might work together, and here I'm not sure whether this is positive or not, is Venezuela. And I don't know where that would leave Venezuela. Once again, though, the sort of muddled first 48 hours that Monica referred to played out in foreign policy with, statements from Bolsonaro's campaign saying that he'll work with Colombia, and Colombians saying, no, we won't. We don't know about this. So I think it's too early to say, but there are signs that there's a shift underway. We just don't know exactly how it'll play.
But the good news is that we probably have a Braganza possibly coming in as foreign minister. So we'll be restoring the glory of the empire in terms of Brazilian foreign policy.
Absolutely.
And the very large questions that were dealt with by Dom Pedro will now be dealt with, if he is a foreign minister, by his great-great-great-great-grandson.
I don't think we can really say almost anything about foreign policy now, for a simple reason that the only thing Bolsonaro continues to say is simply that he likes the way Trump deals with things. So he's going to move the embassy of Brazil to Jerusalem. He's going to follow Trump's lead on half a dozen issues. Now, whether he can do any of that, given, you say, the historical patterns, but, the U.S. and Brazil have never had a very close relationship. There's always been a distance, not that we've been adversaries or that it's simply we have never really sort of been able to establish any kind of deep cooperation on almost any issue you can think of, whether it's military or peacekeeping, or there's occasional cooperation, but there's very little, and I don't suspect there's going to be very much more, particularly given Brazil's relation with China, that it's going to be very hard to sort of move out of that relationship, given the economic importance, the economic dependence virtually of Brazil, and particularly the agricultural sector. And that tends to be the biggest issue for the Trump administration, is to reduce China's presence, influence in Latin America, and Brazil is not going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of questions from the audience. I think we should collect, Claudia,
yes,
three questions, and then we'll have a round.
Let's start here, then Michael, you, and then we'll go to the other side.
Timothy Towell, former Foreign Service officer, 30 years.
Please tell who you address your question to.
Anybody. The question is foreign policy, trips of the new president. Chile, I get that. United States, Ray, he's in charge of that. Israel, are they going to Israel because of the United States leaning on a lot of countries in this hemisphere to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? And Jared, the son-in-law, is leaning on them? Or do they have a special Brazilian relationship of itself with going to Israel?
Okay, Michael?
Thank you. Michael Shifter, Inter-American Dialogue, great panel, great insights. I was just thinking, listening to all of you, Peter wrote an article very persuasively saying that Lula should have been allowed to run. That would have been good for Brazil, for governance in Brazil, despite the cloud, that would have been good. And I'm just wondering what we'll be talking about today if Lula were allowed to run. And all these problems that you've identified of corruption and a strong leader and all of this and the fiscal crisis and everything, polls show that he would have beaten Bolsonaro. So would we change our analysis completely about Brazil if Lula had defeated Bolsonaro 2 days ago in the second round? I mean, it just seems to me that we have to include the factor of the individual is not irrelevant. And you said Bolsonaro might be the right person at the right moment. But what if he was up against Lula and not Haddad?
Michael, can you pass the microphone to the person behind you?
Hi, thank you. Victoria Rhoda with the Center for International Private Enterprise. So I guess this question goes more to Monica, but anyone who's willing to answer. So today a lot of different things were stated about the Bolsonaro presidency. But a main issue was that Guedes decided that his economic ministry is going to encompass the finance ministry, which includes the treasury, the planning ministry, and the Ministry of Industry and Trade. So I guess my question is twofold. Number one, do you see this as an issue of power concentration and therefore lack of checks and balances? And number two, what are the consequential potential impacts in economic policy, given that a lot of people justified their vote on Bolsonaro based on his incredible economic policy under Guedes, of course?
Well, let's, regarding Israel, I'm going to attempt an answer. As Trump here, Bolsonaro has a strong support of evangelicals in Brazil, and it's mainly a response to this. He is an evangelical, and is a response to his evangelical base. I don't know if anybody wants to add something. So who would face the question of
Lula?
What would happen if Lula were allowed to run?
This is like walking into a minefield, which may be what you were. But I think a lot of people would be saying, well, Brazil is not a rule of law country then. Because for Lula to have run, he would have had to, there would have been some way, a jeitinho, to get him out. And that wouldn't have been the right way to run. I think I agree, though, with the point that Peter made, which was simply that if he had run, he might not have won as well. And I bet our pollster could tell us. But, well, some people have suggested that if Lula had been, Lula in prison, not being allowed to run, gets the sympathy vote. Lula out there running and forced to defend himself against the corruption charge perhaps doesn't do as well. And on this point, I think it's really important for us to think about the fact that although the PT did much better than many people expected, they got only 11 million votes fewer than Bolsonaro, we've seen a gradual decline in the vote totals for the PT over time. And, the PT lost, I think, 19% of the seats that it had in Congress, in the lower house. The PT couldn't elect its former president. She didn't even come in first or second in the Senate race. She came in fourth. So, I think, I'm not certain that a Lula running, actually being there concretely would have won. Peter had better.
I mean, I don't have any, better guessing about who would have won. But certainly, the fact that Haddad ended up with 45% of the vote, a person that was relatively unknown, that lost re-election as for mayor of Sao Paulo, doesn't have the charm, the communication skills of Lula, etc. It would seem to me that it would have been almost inevitable if he had run that he would have won. His popularity was growing up until the very date that he couldn't run. And I guess my argument, just to make it clear, was that Fernando Henrique Cardoso made a statement that the best solution to Brazil's problems would be have Lula run and lose. And actually, Michel Temer said the same thing, reinforced what Lula had said.
God bless Temer.
But of course, God bless Reardon. And the point is that in order for Lula to lose, you have to let him run. And so are we sort of seeing a conflict between the rule of law and democracy? I mean, let the people decide if they want him in jail or if they want him to be president. But like I say, if you want him to lose in the election and create a more normal situation, then you have to let him run. If you let him run, he could win. And I think that that's the second best, would have been if he ran and won, would be second best. The best probably would have been if he ran and lost.
No, not necessarily.
We don't know to whom. Well, but I mean, I'm just saying that's
so I'm going to be
I was talking without knowing where Bolsonaro was at the time, but that was, I was very far, my predictive powers were immense.
I'm going to be the contrarian. Our base case for Bolsonaro, Haddad was 80-20. Those were the odds, second round. Our base case for Lula, Bolsonaro was 60-40 for Bolsonaro. And let me kind of lay out the logic of a professional electoral forecaster. So first thing, beware of horse race polls early in the electoral season. Obviously, Lula has a history, historical figure, very resonant, very strong, especially with the PT base and beyond. But beware of horse race polls. The most important thing we look at above and beyond our econometric models that we use is how strong the candidates are on the main priorities. What we know is the following, and this is a global data point. Candidates that are strongest on the main priority win elections 85% of the time. The number one issue, as I said before, was corruption. The second was a strong leader to take the country back. Bolsonaro outstripped Haddad and Lula, because we polled both this and tracked it over the course of the electoral cycle, by 30 points. Okay? Obviously, that's 85% of the time. You have 15%. And so is Lula a 15%er? Is he an off diagonal? Is he an outlier? Yes. And so our base case is 60-40. He has a 40% chance of winning. That's pretty darn good given everything that happened. But we still would have started with that base case because Lula did not correspond to what the population was demanding at the time. He had basically a lower ceiling than he historically did, and a higher floor.
Cliff, can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
If Haddad won 45%,
let's
do you
move
think
on.
Lula would win more?
Peter, we need to get to, sorry to cut you off, but we need to get to other questions from the audience.
Answer the question?
And I will answer the question
Let's
on
go
the,
to this side.
on the ministries. So the ministries of the industry and commerce, planning and finance are three they do very different things. And obviously, putting all of these three ministries under one super ministry of the economy, which is the plan that's being spoken of right now, could be extremely messy, especially when it comes to industry and commerce, where mainly what they do is completely different from what the planning and the finance ministries do. So the way I see this is less of a power grabbing. I don't think it is that. I think it is a response to this claim that Bolsonaro has made that he wants to reduce the number of ministries to 15. And so this is the way he's going about it, on the one hand. Which, by the way, reducing the number of ministries does not mean that you reduce the number of cabinet positions up for horse trading that you need to build your coalitions. Because what often happens when countries say that they're going to reduce ministries is that they create secretariats. Exactly. Which is probably what's going to happen in Brazil if indeed the number of ministries is diminished. But in any event, uniting these three ministries is going to be a mess. And for Guedes, who already has to navigate a very complicated situation, and on top of that is someone with no policy-making experience whatsoever, because he's never done it, he's never been there. He's a financial market guy who came straight from the financial market into the government. It doesn't seem to me like he'd be a very able super minister, as in fact he has already shown himself kind of not to be in the past 48 hours.
Okay, let's go here.
Thank you. Rob Warren. I'd like to have a more general statement from you. We have a national catharsis in Korea and Brazil that I think will last for several decades. It's going to be very disruptive. What does this mean for South America? Brazil represents half the continent. What's going to happen if Brazil is going to tank?
Mm-hmm. Could you pass the microphone to the behind you? Yes, the guy with the glasses.
Hello, my name is David Dye. I'm a second-year MA here at SAIS. My question for the panel is about crisis. This was clearly a vote, as Professor DeBoll said, a vote of repudiation in this election. My question is, what happens as far as the evolution from Brazil from here on out? Could we potentially see somewhere down the line some sort of chance for real institutional reform based on the trajectory of events?
Thank you.
Can you pass the microphone to the girl at your left side?
Hi, I am Jamie Dorner. I work for the Risk Advisory Group, and I'm a former student of Professor Taylor. My question is actually for Professor DeBoll. You alluded to this before, that the markets right now are ecstatic that Bolsonaro's in power, but we don't see that lasting for a long time. So I wanted to know, from your point of view, both the very short-term and long-term assessment of investment in Brazil and investment going into Brazil from public as well.
Professor Rick, can you address the first two questions?
The evolution of Brazil.
And what happened in Latin America?
Oh, I have no idea what happened in Latin America, but I do know that God is a Brazilian and all things will be fine at some point.
And it's the country of the future.
And it's the country of the future and always will be. Brazil's not going to tank. Half continents don't tank. They may go the wrong way, but at some point there's a correction. And we've seen corrections in Brazilian history going back to the fall of the empire, all through the Republic, and then through Vargas, and through the post-1946 period and the military years. There's always a correction, and the correction lasts for a short time, longer, shorter, and then there's another collapse. And then we come back and have another correction. That's the Brazilian history over its entire history. So I don't think we should really move back from that. And a final note on this PT with Lula thing. Lula couldn't have won. The sentiment, anti-PT sentiment, was so visceral in Brazil. And how could the PT run on an anti-corruption platform? One of the most corrupt party in Brazil. Very, very difficult to imagine.
Monica.
So the issue of how fast we're going to see the rude awakening, so to speak, I don't know, but I expect that that time frame is going to be shorter than most people had realized going into these elections. I think those who supported Bolsonaro from within the financial markets, there were two camps. There was a camp that was very, very much pro-Bolsonaro and who really believed in the powers of Paulo Guedes. And there was another camp that simply saw in PT's program a very bad program, which it was. I read the two programs. The PT program was not a PowerPoint presentation. It was actually a full-fledged document. But it was basically everything that Dilma did taken to another level. So it would have been extremely messy for the economy, at least if that was the plan to be followed. So within markets, there were those two views. The election of Bolsonaro and the fact that a lot of the incoming people are people who have absolutely no policymaking experience coming into an extremely difficult situation, for me, doesn't bode very well in the short term. So I think if there is a honeymoon period at all, once he's in office, there's a bit of a honeymoon period right now, but it's kind of meaningless because the government only begins on January 1st, 2019. If there is a bit of a honeymoon period, I think soon that will basically disappear into the ether, because what we have is a situation where, again, very tough reforms need to be passed, where the government is going to have to figure out how in the world it's going to build a coalition to pass these reforms. And on top of that, all of the imminent issues that need to be faced. Fiscal adjustment, by the way, is not just pension reform. Fiscal adjustment is raising taxes and cutting spending. Brazil doesn't have any more room to cut spending, so it's going to have to raise taxes, which again is extremely unpopular. So the likelihood of that happening within the first 3 months of the government, and by the way, the first 3 months Brazil doesn't really do anything because that's before Carnival. Things only really start happening after Carnival. But in any event, the likelihood of anything happening in that time horizon, I think, are very slim. And with that in mind, I think people are going to realize very fast that there are unsustainable issues that won't be resolved, and we'll have some market turbulence before things get better. That's how I see it.
Let's go to the back. Here. To the guy in the white. Then you can pass the microphone to the person behind you, and then the person ahead of you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name is Walt Donner with S&P Global. My question is for Professor DeBoll regarding the privatization agenda of the incoming administration. I understand that the quote-unquote crown jewels are more or less off the table, Petrobras, Electrobras, but there are about 100 smaller firms that are being discussed for being privatized. What are those firms? Can you characterize them for me? Like, how large are they? And what are the prospects of actually succeeding in a privatization effort? And what would be the kind of underlying impact with respect to the fiscal crisis, should that be successful?
Okay, can pass microphone? Yes.
No, there's one question here.
Hi. I'm Andrea Murta with Jota News in Brazil. My question is for Monica. So, being optimistic and thinking that eventually the Bolsonaro government will present a plan for pension reform, what are the key points that you're going to be looking at this plan to see if it's going to actually have an impact and make a dent in our problems, or if it's just something for show?
Thank you. One final question here.
The microphone is there. Let's ask the woman that is in front, then you come here.
Claudia, it's 7:30. So we have one final question here.
Who is the person?
She's got the mic.
You have the mic, right?
Okay.
The mic speaks.
My name is Marina, I'm Brazilian, and my question is about corruption that was said it's not the main problem of Brazil. And Monica and the others professors addressed a lot of bigger problems than corruption, but in Brazil we do blame corruption for these other problems. So if it's not corruption, what it is the big issue or the main problem of Brazil?
We all agree corruption.
I think we all agreed that corruption was a big issue.
Because I think
all
Professor Taylor
interconnected.
said that it's not the biggest issue, not the main problem, and then you and the other professor said addressed a lot of real problems as well. And we blame corruption for these problems, so then what is...
Well, let me just say one word about that. The economic crisis is not a product of corruption per se. It's a product of a lot of mismanagement of economic policy. But that is not to say that corruption is not the main issue. It is the main issue. I'm Brazilian too. And so, you know, it is most certainly the main issue. And it is in some ways connected to all the other issues that we mentioned. But it does have its own sort of standing, at least as it relates to what's been happening in Brazil over the past few years, if not decades. So none of us, I think, would ever say that corruption is not a principal issue. I think all of us are in agreement that it is a very major one. Let me turn to the other two questions. So the question about privatization. So yes, the crown jewels are off the table. Those would be the oil company Petrobras, Banco do Brasil, which is a commercial bank, partly owned by the government, Electrobras, which is an electricity company, and finally Caixa Econômica Federal, which is a mortgage lender, and a black box mortgage lender at that, because they were doing a lot of other types of lending during Rousseff's time in government, and we don't know exactly what kind of balance sheet situation they have because it's not publicized. So with those four companies off the table, yes, there are a range of other, I mean, there are hundreds of state-owned companies in Brazil, but by and large, they're very small. And even if it were feasible, let's say it were feasible to sell all of these companies, we wouldn't come anywhere near closing the fiscal gap. So if we were to say privatize the postal office, for example, or privatize the Trem Bala company, for example, you know, it doesn't come anywhere near scratching the surface of the fiscal problems that Brazil has. Again, like I said, we're heading towards 100% of GDP of debt. Selling off, you know, these small companies that don't really do anything, and that basically suck up a lot of resources but don't generate much revenue, yes, it would give you a little bit of a fiscal space, but it would not serve for reducing the debt. So I don't think anybody believes that, you know, that privatization plan would actually be meaningful in any way. Plus, there's the issue of whether or not that's even doable, given that, Bolsonaro's electorate is not exactly on board with the privatization idea. And we don't even know if Bolsonaro himself is on board with the privatization idea, given that, at heart, he's always been an economic nationalist, and I have yet to see reason to believe that he's not one. If I see reason to believe that he's not one, I'll be the first to say that I was wrong, but I haven't seen it so far. So pension reform. On pension reform, the things that need to be done are mainly there's a lot to be done, and it's a three-pillar system, and it's very complicated. But there are two issues with pension reform. The first issue is that currently it's unsustainable. So you need to make it sustainable. And by making it sustainable, you have to make a lot of changes to it. The second issue is that the pension reform, and this is something that I cannot understand why the discussion has never gone there, the second issue. The pension system in Brazil is extremely regressive, which means that it benefits the rich at the expense of the poor. So when the Temer administration was discussing pension reform, which is, as I said, very unpopular, I do not understand why they did not put the regressivity issue on the table. Because you can actually improve the system and make it sustainable and make it more progressive at the same time. You can do both. So I don't understand why they never sold the reform that way. In my mind, the main element that you need to see in this pension reform is you need to include the military and you need to include the judiciary. Now, is the Bolsonaro government going to include the military in pension reform? I'm not holding my breath.
Okay.
So I'd like to thank everyone. I'm sorry we have to end so abruptly, but it's way beyond our time. Thank you so much for coming. I know we've left a lot of you frustrated because you weren't able to ask your questions, but well, we can talk in the reception at least a bit, and hopefully, and we can do another panel in January to see how things are going. So, thank you very much for coming.